Today is Monday, April 14th, 2025. This is Quick Start from CBN News. I'm Dan Andros. A governor's house is set on fire. Love that top story and more on today's podcast, where we bring you news from a Christian perspective. Don't forget to subscribe and leave a rating on your favorite podcast platform of choice. Also, you can email us as well, quickstartpodcast@cbn.org. We would love to hear from you, even if you're just saying hello. We enjoy that you're here. We're glad that you're here getting through the news of the Cray with us each and every weekday, bright and early. And joining me today, CBN's Billy Hallowell. Billy, on the focus story, Christian author Lee Strobel is exploring the supernatural.
Yeah, he's got a new book out, Seeing the Supernatural, all about angels and demons and near-death experiences. So we'll get into that project.
All right, looking forward to that. Also, on the main thing, the DOJ takes action on men playing in women's sports. Madison Seals has the details there. We'll get to all of that and more coming up, including the News in 90, which is up next in 30 seconds, right after this.
Let me tell you, the God's gonna cut you.
It's Holy Week in Jerusalem, and the city is restless. The people of Israel welcome Jesus as king, his followers ready for revolution. But instead of taking the throne, Jesus turns the tables.
Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees! How will you escape being condemned to hell?
Experience Holy Week like never before.
What have you done?
Coming soon to theaters, The Chosen, Last Supper. Get your tickets now.
And a suspected arsonist set fire to Pennsylvania the Pennsylvania governor's mansion early Sunday while Governor Josh Shapiro and his family were asleep inside. Authorities arrested 38-year-old Cody Balmer, who allegedly scaled a fence, evaded troopers, and used homemade incendiary devices to start the fire. Shapiro called the attack part of a growing wave of political violence and said it has to stop. No injuries were reported, but the fire caused significant damage to parts of the residence. Balmer faces charges including attempted murder, terrorism, and aggravated arson. Leaders from both parties condemned the attack, calling it a disturbing reminder of threats facing public officials and their families. Stock futures rose Sunday after the Trump administration temporarily exempted electronic imports from China from new tariffs. Dow futures climbed 200 points, while Nasdaq surged over 1%, boosted by relief for tech firms like Apple and Microsoft. The exempt isn't permanent, though. Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick said additional tariffs may come after a national security review of semiconductor imports. And it's Holy Week. Chris Mitchell was live yesterday at the Mount of Olives as Holy Week begins on Palm Sunday, and he reflected on Jesus' humble yet prophetic entrance into Jerusalem. You can check out that live stream. If you missed it, it's on the CBN News YouTube channel. Check it out now. I'll put the link in the description, but just go to the CBN News YouTube channel and click on the live tab. You'll see it in there. It's great stuff from Chris Mitchell, as always. Those are just some of today's top headlines. Check out more stories over at CBNnews.com. And it is finally here, Billy. It is Holy Week, and it's a great week for Christians. Obviously, the sadness of Christ on the cross, the pain, the suffering that he had to endure. But obviously, we all know the reason why. This was his plan. This was his salvation plan we see it enacted from Genesis 3 in Scripture. And here it is. This is the weekend. Kicks off on Palm Sunday. I don't know what your sermon was yesterday, Billy, but ours was talking about, of course, Palm Sunday, and the triumphal entrance, but focused on the donkey, which was interesting. We hadn't seen this one, and just kind of putting all the significance on there, showing how Mark in chapter 11 actually spends a lot of time in that section 1 through 11, a lot of it on the donkey. And so we talked about the significance of that. It's very interesting stuff.
Yeah, no, we had a somewhat normal. We talked about Palm Sunday, and then a somewhat normal service, and then Friday we're going to have a bigger service. And yeah, it's interesting, the donkey, because you don't think about all these details. And every year when we start to go through Holy Week, I think of something new, or I realize something new, and that's the cool part about the gospel and the Bible more generally. You can read the same story 150 times, and every time something new stands out to you, right? So like the donkey you wouldn't have thought of maybe, but this year it's standing out. And so I just encourage people to look as the week goes on at the different details and maybe ask God to kind of guide you to those different pieces that you hadn't thought of.
Yeah. And I'll give you one example, because obviously it was a whole sermon, but by my pastor, Steve Adler, and talked about how the one verse says that it was a donkey that no one had previously sat on or ridden before. And so then he goes into a big crowd and talking about how, well, what do you do before you ride a horse or ride a dog? You've got to break that animal, get them used to that, because they spook easily and they don't want, it's like a weird thing. They're like, get off my back, And so it's essentially miraculous that he was able to just be the first one to get on this donkey and then go ride it through this throng of crowd, a huge crowd that's all around him. And then it just completely is tame and is like, oh yeah, I'm good with this. So just things like that. So lots of little details that perhaps hadn't focused on before. So very, very cool stuff. But hopefully, and let us know what your church is doing. We'd love to hear what your church is doing this week on Holy Week. And also make sure you're on the CBN News YouTube channel. Chris Mitchell's going live each and every day from a different location in Scripture. They're in Jerusalem. That's mentioned in Scripture. Like we said there, they used Mount of Olives yesterday. Make sure you're checking that out. CBN News YouTube channel. All right, we're going to head to the focus story now, and Christian author Lee Strobel is exploring the supernatural in his new books. Tell me about this.
Yeah, so the new book, the title and the subtitle kind of give a little bit of a lens into what he's doing, but it's called Seeing the Supernatural, Investigating Angels, Demons, Mythical Dreams, Near-Death Encounters, and Other Mysteries of the Unseen World. The thing that's interesting about Lee Strobel is he's a journalist at heart. He worked for the Chicago Tribune. He knows law very well. He covered legal matters, legal affairs. And so when he approaches a topic, he does it from a statistical, analytical, proof perspective. That's how he's always operated. That's why The Case for Christ was such a big book, The Case for Faith. And so he takes that same approach to the supernatural. And he told me, and Jen Lilly, we had him on our new podcast, and we actually have the video on CBN too. It's called Into the Supernatural, but we had him on, and he basically talked about the fact that he sort of sees this issue of the supernatural as a bridge where we can connect with people who might actually be far from God and yet have an interest in these topics, right? So a lot of non-believers who, they're interested in angels, they are interested in demons. This is why Hollywood churns out all those demonic movies every year, right? And so it's like, how do you take that topic and bring people back in? He said it may be an entryway for them to really learn about what the Bible does teach about the world beyond our physical realm. So as an evangelist, he said that's always his desire, and he found this topic to be a really interesting way to sort of bridge those divides. And he said it was an adventure as he sort of dove in. He spent a couple of years looking at each of these topics. And one thing that he found, and we've talked about this a lot, is that a lot of Christians, some Christians, he said, are hesitant to fully embrace these issues even. So it's not just people in the outside world, outside of the church. A lot of people inside the church have a lot of questions, and they want corroboration, and they want to understand. So the book also sort of helps meet that need as well.
And what did he find surrounding the near-death experience sort of situations?
Yeah, this is interesting because we've talked a lot about near-death experiences. There's a lot of debate theologically around them, but he finds them incredibly compelling. And, he said that he found many documented cases of near-death experiences where people have seen or heard things that would have been impossible for them to have seen or heard had they not had this authentic out-of-body experience after a clinical death. And in his view, he said it really reinforces what Scripture tells us about the supernatural. And he said it actually can give people a lot of courage in their faith. But he shared an example of this woman who was clinically dead in a hospital, and she claimed to have had her spirit separate from her body, the whole thing that we hear again and again. But in this case, she told the people in the hospital afterwards, she had said her body had traveled up, and she told them, look, if you go and look on that fan, there was a ceiling fan, you're going to see a red sticker on the top of one of the, part. There's no way she could have seen this red sticker because it was hidden. It was on top of the fan. And when they got a ladder and went up to look, the exact sticker was in the exact place she said it was. So there's these crazy kind of examples, like that he encountered that were documented where people explain that this is what this person was telling them, and that it turned out to be true. So you can do with that information what you want, but there was a lot of data and cases that were, definitely documented like that one.
Did anything really stand out to him as far as like a surprise, like something that really raised his eyebrows, like, oh, wow, I didn't expect that, or that's crazy, or anything like that?
Yeah, I think it was examples like that. There was another one. I mean, and this was the case across like miracles, near-death experiences, everything, where there was a person who said that their body had gone above, they had left their body, they had gone up, and they described what was on the roof of the hospital. And they said there's a pair of like white shoes in their and they described exactly where they were on the roof of the hospital, right? And this is a person who was in a medical emergency. They had never been to the hospital before, and certainly hadn't been on the roof. I mean, how many people have access to the roof of a hospital? And when they went up to the roof, same thing. Shoes were exactly where they described them being in the exact place. So you have these things that I think for him became evidence. And again, Lee Strobel doesn't like say lightly that he just thinks these things are true. And that's what makes him so interesting. He found a lot of corroboration for these things.
Yeah. And we've been talking a lot about this topic, obviously, with your documentary, investigating supernatural miracles. You can find it at cbn.com/supernatural. And it's just really fascinating to look at. And, Billy, I'm curious to get what you think, Lee's, and also what you think are sort of like the lasting impact of these stories. Like as Christians, like what's the value? What's the, sort of edification that we get looking at these stories? What have you been finding, and what do you think Lee finds?
Yeah, no, I think everybody is recognizing that these stories, they point you back to God. He said he thinks it's kind of opening people's eyes to the fact that these aren't just stories you hear at Sunday school. They're not just biblical stories, which of course matter, and we know they're true. But he said when you dig into many of these stories, you find substance, and you find that a lot of these eyewitnesses have no motive to deceive people. There are medical records, and we saw this when we were doing the documentary too. And so that big question of why are these things still happening? I think for people like Lee and others, they would say, well, miracles haven't ceased. God is still acting the way he always has. He's God. He can do what he wants to do. It doesn't mean you're always going to have a miracle, but they point back to evidence of God. And I think that's interesting, right? In a world where so many people are confused, and yet a lot of young people are turning to God. We're seeing this not just in America. We just did a story on the American Bible Society and the numbers. And we'll actually have some of that tomorrow on the main thing with the head of the American Bible Society talking about that data. It's showing that people are turning back to faith. So all of this seems to be pointing to that. But I would also say too, it feels like the more you talk to people, Ephesians 6, this idea of the spiritual war, that you're seeing more of these kinds of stories. And we don't have all the numbers to know if more miracles are happening or more, but people are talking about it more. Same with spiritual warfare. You're seeing a lot of people talk about those topics. So it feels like something is happening spiritually, not just in America, but around the world. And I think this is part of that. But, we have to kind of wait and see what happens, right?
Yeah. I mean, listen, you have to consider that, just like you said, talking about it, the fact that these are discussions, those are open doors for Christians and for the conversations that we're in. And you have to look at that as a net win, especially in a world that's kind of in the last couple decades or so, like shifted towards a materialist, secular sort of worldview. These sorts of things fly directly in the face of that, right? When all you can hope for is in the material and I don't know, I guess the repetition or the scientific laws of nature and those sorts of things. We know that God is obviously outside of that because he created it all and he spoke things into existence. He can do whatever he wants to do. And so I think these sorts of things open people's minds to these conversations. So I think it's a great thing. Any final thoughts?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that these are the kinds of issues that we deal with. I would encourage people to go check out the documentary. We deal with the miracles. If you go to cbn.com/supernatural, you can watch that and see some of these other stories. No matter where you stand, whether you believe in miracles still or not, it's worth checking it out and being challenged.
All right, good stuff, Billy. Thanks for bringing that to the podcast today. Definitely appreciate it. All right, the DOJ is taking action on men playing in women's sports. More on that coming up in 30 seconds.
Let me tell you, the God's gonna cut you.
It's Holy Week in Jerusalem. Crowds welcome Jesus as king. Rebellion is in the air.
Jesus operates outside our jurisdiction.
Rome will descend on us all.
But instead of taking the throne, Jesus turns the tables.
My house shall be called a house of prayer, but you make it a den of thieves.
The world will never be the same. Coming soon to theaters, The Chosen: Last Supper. Get your tickets now.
All right, the U.S. Department of Justice and the Department of Education launched a special task force dedicated to protecting female athletes from males trying to compete in their sports. Sheri Few, with U.S. parents involved in education, joined Madison Seals to talk about why this effort has become necessary. That conversation is today's main thing.
The Trump administration recently announced on April 4th a new team that will help enforce his executive orders to protect Title IX. Sheri, what are your thoughts on this new Title IX Special Investigations Team?
I'm very happy to see this step because, as it was pointed out by the DOJ cabinet director, it sometimes takes a year or longer to conclude one investigation under Title IX. And there are a ton of complaints that have been filed. And even before Trump issued his executive orders, there was a backlog in Title IX complaints. So this is a very important issue. The law is being violated. And it's very important in some of the left-leaning states because they have laws in their states in place that conflict with the executive order. So, for example, in Washington state, they have a state law that says transgender women can compete in girls' sports. And so that's the law, and it has to be complied with by the district. So then you've got the federal executive order saying that they cannot. So the federal law and the state law are in conflict, and both are threatening to withhold funding. So these school districts don't know where to turn. And many of the school districts, again, in a very left-leaning state, in Washington state, are working together to file complaints, and the task force will be so instrumental in helping them to rectify the conundrum they find themselves in between the state and the federal laws. By the way, in Washington state, they don't see this as a political issue. They are people from both sides of the aisle believe that this is wrong. And they're standing up and fighting against it. There are several school boards that are working together to file complaints and against not only the state, but also the Department of Education there in Washington state.
We've already seen a few cases crop up where a school has tried to work around the Title IX protections, or a state to allow a male student to compete on a girls' team or be in a female space. And you mentioned that there are some who see this as a bipartisan issue. So why shouldn't schools be allowed to hide gender transitions from parents?
Well, I think that's obvious to anyone who is a parent and even people who may not be parents. Parents have the absolute right, and this has been determined in law through decisions by the Supreme Court, that they have the right to direct the upbringing of their child and no one else. And so this isn't even an educational issue. This is, gender identity is a social construct, and it has no business in the education realm. And parents are outraged that their children are being groomed and advocating for this kind of lifestyle behind their backs. And when they learn about it, it's as though it's a crime, or that it's abuse on their part for trying to protect their children or getting them the psychological help that they need to deal with this dysphoria. Another example from Washington state is that it was shared with me that there are 30,000 trans kids in the state of Washington. That is outrageous. We have to recognize that this is epidemic proportions. And 10 years ago, we never saw this. It was an isolated case here or there. So it is obvious that the government schools are grooming and pushing children toward what is a mental illness. Gender dysphoria is considered a mental illness, and government schools are responsible for evoking this mental illness among children.
Why do you think that this issue is being prioritized now by the Trump administration? Why is this so important now?
Well, first of all, it was part of Trump's campaign agenda. It was a promise he made that he would make and put an end to this madness. And it's a very important issue that I think even affected the outcome of his election. So just like all of the other campaign promises he made, he is quickly working to make good on these promises. And this is an issue that the country, again, you mentioned and I've mentioned, it's a bipartisan issue. It's a common sense issue. It flies in the face of science. It is clear that there are only two genders. And for government schools to be pushing this liberal agenda on children and their families is a crime. Quite frankly, we believe that it is child abuse.
And, as you said, this is a big effort by the Trump administration to follow through on promises to protect women's sports and protect children in general, which is amazing. But you also say it's not time for parents to stop paying attention. So how can parents help protect their children from this radical gender ideology in public schools?
Well, first of all, parents do need to remain vigilant and not become complacent because President Trump is making such great strides so quickly. We have to understand that there are rogue teachers and rogue administrators that are going to try to defy the law. We've seen it with critical race theory, the DEI instruction. They have simply already rebranded and just put under a different name. So parents need to be vigilant. They need to communicate with their children and stay on top of what they're learning. And really, our organization, United States Parents Involved in Education, believes that the government schools have become toxic. And the best way to protect your child is to just find an alternative form of education. And so it's unfortunate that it's come to that point, but that's what we're dealing with because there has been decades now of indoctrination of young teachers in the colleges of education. They believe in these theories, these false theories, and they've been trained to implement and embed these things into every subject and every grade level. So it's going to be difficult for a teacher who believes in these false ideologies, to be willing to give up on what it is they've been trained and believe in the children in their jurisdiction. So the best way to protect your children, unfortunately, is to get them out. And there are lots of good alternatives. There are good private and Christian schools. And of course, we believe homeschooling is the best alternative for parents.
All right. Appreciate that conversation there, Madison. That's going to leave us with time on the podcast today for one last thing.
We've got Deuteronomy 10:21. He is the one you praise. He is your God who performed for you those great and awesome wonders you saw with your own eyes. And of course, you're dealing with context there, but the reality of a God who never changes, who is always performing amazing wonders that we can trust and rely on.
Yeah, absolutely. And so often, just like the Israelites, right? They forgot about these amazing things God did, leading them out of Egypt, etc. And we forget too what God has done for us in our lives, for the forgiveness, the grace, the mercy that he's provided for us. And what a better week to remember that and to focus on that than Holy Week. So good spot to leave it there on the Monday edition of the Quick Start Podcast. As always, get on over to cbnnews.com, faithwire.com for more news from a Christian perspective. Lord willing, that creek don't rise. We'll be back here tomorrow. God bless. See you then.